showing us how to use the chat function. So asking, where are you today? And in one word, how are you feeling? Finchley and fabulous from Esri. Fantastic. Let's see others pile in with their comments. I'll put mine in.
Numbers are turning up now. There we go.
Good. Tanya. Hi, Tanya. Welcome.
Hi, Rose.
And Rose, nice to see you. Hi. Just asking you to put in the chat where you're calling in from and one word to describe how you're feeling. Alliteration is rewarded. Hi, Tanya. Nice to see you. Near Inverness and inspired. Lovely. We've got Joss in Hampshire feeling Tigger today.
I thought it was to say trigger happy.
Trigger happy.
That's on Tuesdays. Trigger happy Tuesdays, Liam.
And we've got Rose in Twickenham feeling efficient. Very good. Always good on
come off a board meeting. That makes you super efficient.
Ah, well done. Yes. And we've got Leslie and Liz joining us now. So those of you that are new to chat and connect, the idea is to really look around the bingo card of faces here to see if you recognise anybody, and do make connections with those that you don't, that pique your interest. And use the chat function throughout this coming hour to ask questions, to say what's on your mind, and we'll try and incorporate that into our questioning when we're talking to our guests today. So Liam,
for those people just joining us, we're just going to let a few more people in, and then we'll kick off in about a minute. Just get the numbers in and see how. Well, it's quite interesting looking at this sheet of postage stamps with lots of faces on it.
Good. Liz and Leslie, hi, welcome to the call. If you could just drop into the chat how you're feeling, where you're based today, just to get us a little idea of who's on the call. We've got Tanya in Brighton feeling busy. Excellent. Mark from Hitchin feeling relaxed and ready to go. Very good.
Sorry, there's another Brighton person, Tanya. Another Tanya, another Brighton person. Oh,
we met just a few months back in the middle of COVID, didn't we, Tanya? Only online so far.
Yeah. Have you worked out how close you are to each other?
We haven't, no. Maybe a mile or so? Yeah. You're in Hove, aren't you?
Yeah.
And then we've got Gareth from a little village in Cambridgeshire feeling like learning more. Oh gosh, no pressure, speakers.
Gareth, what's the little village called?
The little village is called Whittlesea, that you've probably never heard of, but you might have heard of Ramsey or somewhere like that. So a little bit further north than that.
Lovely.
Whittlesea.
Okay. And then we've got Leslie saying hi from a bit of a dull Derbyshire, and Tom saying Tom in Westbourne Grove feeling curious. Excellent. Good words coming up here.
So should we get started, because we've got a lot to pack in an hour, and people will my experience is that quite a lot of people come in the first 10 minutes or so, but rather than wait for them, let's get things kicked off. So we're asking people generally to stay muted during the call. That's principally so that as you eat your crisps or your chocolate hobnobs, you don't make the rest of us jealous. But hopefully you'll make full use of the chat box to express yourself. If we need to bring you in and you've said something that we want to know more, something intriguing that you've written in the chat box, Annabel or I will either unmute you or just directly ask you to unmute yourself. But if you could stay muted for now. In case there is anyone still out there who is unfamiliar with Zoom, I just want to run through a couple of things. Obviously, you know where the microphone is down the bottom, so that enables you to mute or unmute yourself. There's also the camera. It's up to you entirely whether or not you have your vision on. It's quite nice to see you. And part of the point of what we're trying to do today is get people to connect. So if you wanted to show yourself, that's great. If you don't, then that's your call entirely. I recently did some training with a dozen people in Abu Dhabi, and the screen was entirely blacked out, and it was very disconcerting trying to measure how excited or bored people were with my teaching technique when it's completely like that. So up to you, turn it on or not. Just further along, you'll see the participants button there. If you click on that, you can see who else is in the session. You can raise your hands. You can send them a direct message if you wanted, just by clicking on that. that's if you want to do that. It's a bit like one of those 70s discos, isn't it, where they used to have telephones on the table and you could ring up, or maybe I'm just showing my age, who knows. And then next to that is the chat box, which hopefully you've all discovered by now, and that you're all going to try it out. So open it up if you haven't already, and tell us where you are. So tell us where in the world you are today, and in a word how you're feeling, just to show that you know how the chat box works. That'd be great. So the format for today is that Annabel and I will be chatting with our main guests, and I'll introduce them properly in a moment. And we'll ask you to chatter away using the chat box, and we'll shout out comments as we go. And don't forget to share with us over the course of the session how you're going about and approaching tough news at the moment, or how you may have done it recently. Just put that into the chat box, just to try and give some richness to the conversations as we go. So there's the participants box. If you want to say something particularly, you want to jump in, rather than unmute yourself, you can put your hand up in the chat, in the participants box. Waving your hand on the screen, I've discovered doesn't work. Put your hand up in the participants box, and Annabel or I will call you out and bring you in if you want to bring something to the conversation. So, and just to let you know, we're recording the session, so anything you say can be taken down and will be used in evidence against you. Anything you do not use now will be relied on later. Anyway, you know the score. So that's the form on how to use Zoom. I guess you all know how to do that. The other thing, the one other thing to say is, as you all know from using Zoom recently, if anything goes wrong, be patient. Zoom is incredibly good at fixing itself. Just be patient and it usually comes back to you. If the whole system goes down, if Annabel's internet connection gets cut because she hasn't paid the bill, or put 50p in the meter, then it's all gone to plot. So anyway, great to see you guys. So we're joined today by a few well-known faces from around the world of HR and in comms, and in a variety of other realms. So Annabel.
Yes, well, I'd like to introduce our first guest. We'll introduce all of them before Liam kicks off interviewing Claire. So Claire Vane, do you want to give us a wave, Claire? Fantastic. Claire is the Managing Director of Integrated Resources Limited. I think I've known you for over maybe 2 decades. And she'll be sharing her many years of experience in the world of HR and dealing with some very tricky and interesting situations, and as a self-styled people advisor and a fantastic piano player. Oh yes, and you're going to play us out. You're going to be our house band at the end, aren't you, Claire? So
I'll happily, yes, do the credits.
Thank you very much. We're also joined by Viktoria Tegard. Give us a wave, Victoria. How are you doing up there? I was going to say up in the top right, but she's probably somewhere else on everyone else's screen. Victoria's the global lead on IC at Capita, the 61,000 strong services and outsourcing business. It's a new role, bringing together a central function for the first time. She probably knows quite a few people on this call already, because Victoria's previously you were at GSK. I guess you probably know Joss. He's lurking in there somewhere, Joss Matheson. And previously we met when you were in travel, when you were at Virgin, and previously at TUI as well. So welcome, Victoria. And Annabel.
Lovely, and completing our stellar lineup, we have Rob Stephenson, CEO, who had the pleasure of meeting a couple of years back now at an event looking at mental health, and particularly the fascinating area of encouraging CEOs to admit vulnerability, which I think is a really fascinating area, and Rob's done a huge amount of work in this area. So mental health advocate and founder of InsideOut LeaderBoard, and you'll see in his background looking very professional today, his form score, and I'm sure he'll tell you more about that once we start asking him questions. So nice to see you here, Rob. But back to Liam to kick off with our first interview.
Well, I was actually going to ask you, Annabel, because you've done the pulse score thing, haven't you? So I was going to ask you to tell us about that, to yes, set some context.
Indeed. We went out to about 100 leaders and asked them a pulse question, 2 questions, on whether they felt their line managers were well prepared to handle tough conversations, which is what we're talking about today. And amazingly, none said that they were really well prepared. So this is a big gap, and particularly for those consultants working in this sector, a huge opportunity, I would say. but only 57% said that their line managers are quite well prepared, 29% saying not very well at all. So that's nearly 1 in 3 leaders are saying their line managers aren't as well prepared as they should be. So a huge opportunity for those working in this area. Some of the comments around how to be when having tough conversations, I'm sure that will be echoed tonight amongst our panellists, is the advice were to be prepared, to be open, to be honest, empathetic, authentic, to really be you, which might be a challenge for some in those difficult situations, to give regular updates, so it's not a build up to suddenly having a tough conversation, so there are less surprises, to be transparent, and to really develop your listening skills, which is a key passion for me particularly. So a lot around the empathetic side, which I know Victoria is going to focus on when we speak. So that's the roundup. I'll share that pulse check report with you after the call, if that's useful for you to share back out to your teams as well. And now over to Liam.
Yeah, so I always find those super interesting because it sort of does actually set a bit of a context. And I'm often surprised though about managers not being ready, because quite often managers are, used to handling difficult situations as they progress up their organisation. So it's often surprising that you're dealing with senior leaders who actually aren't ready. And I was going to ask Claire, what kind of tough issues are coming up in organisations that you're seeing in your client base at the moment and among the organisations you work with? What are the issues that management and leaders have to deal with?
Well, we work across most sectors, and I'm seeing exactly what I see normally, but a lot more. So I'm seeing more excellent leadership from those who are good, more dreadful leadership from those who aren't good leaders, and I'm seeing a lot of restructuring. I would say we have 10 restructures on the go, with about a third of our current client base reshaping, reorganising, restructuring, and that started about 3 weeks ago. And the trend is upwards. There's going to be more of it. So that's one variety of difficult conversation. So that's about redundancy, putting people at risk and making it as palatable as it can be, and not just thinking about the law, but the psychology. But the other kind of difficult conversation, which people shy away from even more, is those concerning poor performance and a reluctance, as usual, to tackle the really difficult stuff. Of course, you can use a time of adversity like COVID-19 as an opportunity to tackle some of those second type of difficult conversations using the first kind of methodology. And so in some ways, it's very hard for the person who's running a restructuring exercise. But if you can think about it as an opportunity to do things that you might have procrastinated on, and concentrate on saving those who are left behind, because if you don't tackle things properly, then you're jeopardizing the whole business instead of thinking about those who are left behind by sadly making some reshaping that causes some detriment to somebody.
So to what extent do you find though that managers sometimes I feel very uncomfortable doing that, because they want, they feel some sort of sense of conflict between the need to be compassionate and decent and fair versus the need to take a hard, I suppose, sober look at the performance of the organisation or of teams.
Yes, I think the degree of nervousness and concern depends on the leader himself and herself. And I think if they're knowledgeable enough about what they're doing, they know what their outcome is, and they know why they're doing it, and they have enough understanding of the law, but also a very clear knowledge of their staff and the impact they're going to make on staff. I can remember being HR director many years ago of one of the big law firms, and a rather starchy property partner was appalled to find that a woman threw her arms around his neck when we ran the first redundancy exercise and said, "This is wonderful, I never thought it would happen to me." So knowing your staff is quite important, and sometimes people are ready to see the opportunity of making a change for themselves that you can accelerate. So it's not necessarily all downside. So knowing your own values and knowing where somebody else's values are different from yours, so understanding your staff and planning the project so thoroughly, both from the legal aspect and from the psychological aspect, then I think you can feel more comfortable.
So when we spoke the other day about this, you talked about the need to be really across the relevant regulatory or legal requirements. And as a communicator, I've often had colleagues say to me, "Oh no, we'll let the legal team worry about that." And I've always felt a little bit uncomfortable about that. Is that something that, you know, is that a view that you agree with, that we should let the lawyers just deal with that sort of stuff?
I can't speak for every HR consultant. I can tell you that if I go out for dinner and somebody says, "What do you do?" I never say I'm in human resources. It kills the conversation. I say that I join up dots in organisations. And I think there can never be too much planning in anything, and there can never be too much communicating. And I think what divides some lawyers, and I wouldn't like to accuse all lawyers of this, and some HR consultants, is that they're too hung up on the law and they're not thinking about the impact and what they're trying to achieve. So I go for Stephen Covey's second habit: know your outcome. Know what the legal backcloth is, because it is very easy to drop yourself right in it. Get yourself a lawyer or an HR consultant who thinks that communication is just as important as the law, if not more important. Get the scripts written verbatim if you're feeling uncomfortable, with both aspects in mind. And don't cut any corners. I've got one or two naughty clients who work in the creative industries, and they say, "Oh, I'm not doing that." And I say, well, you don't have to do that, but these are the penalties. This is the kind of potential fine for an unfair dismissal claim. This is a fine for a discrimination claim. And this is what will happen if you breach the contract. And something else I would say is, if you are going to start some reshaping, some redefining to make you fit for the next era, then make sure your contracts of employment are in order now, because the number of times, even in big listed companies, I see contracts of employment that let the restructuring person down when it comes to a termination is surprising.
One of the things I found very helpful years and years and years ago was being sat down by an HR director, and they just said, right, there are certain rules we have to apply here, and rule number one is that we're never actually announcing redundancies. We're always announcing a proposal, and the language always should be around that. And are there any pieces of advice that a comms person you really feel should be across when it comes to working in this sort of world? Are there any things that you should be completely clear about?
If the organisation's big enough and lucky enough that there is a comms person, I'd say, of my experience of most internal HR people, is don't let them run loose alone. Take your pick. Whereas actually we need to say that we're going into a forest, we know where the dangers are, we know where the precipices are. This is what you need to say. This is where we're going, and this is why we're going that way. And the consequences of not doing that are this, so that you actually know the whole picture before you start. I like that bit from Mastermind. I've started, so I'll finish. Do not start any reshaping till you have planned the whole process from start to finish, thinking about even things like people's birth dates, their anniversary dates, whether they've just lost a dog, all these kind of things you should really know, and don't start till you do. But at the same time, recognise the legal penalties for getting something wrong.
One of the things I've found over the years, particularly when you're doing organisations that are doing salami slicing processes, which is sadly still happens quite a lot, is and I think it's going to happen quite a bit coming forward, because organisations will set a target, they'll make some headcount reductions and then achieve those, and then think, crumbs, we haven't hit the bottom yet, we have to go again. One of the things I found was that after a while people become quite inured almost to the process, and it became very easy to get sloppy about stuff like that. You sort of go, okay, right, we're going to do another one tomorrow, right, let's go through the numbers, let's go through the process, and you actually sometimes don't actually realise that you're skipping some quite important stuff, like actually, let's not go out to an announcement until we actually know how many people we're talking about. Let's not go out and make an announcement until we've actually checked that actually we're talking about all the right jurisdictions and those sorts. So it's quite easy sometimes to get just dragged into the process rather than actually stay human, isn't it?
Yes, I think even if you're used to doing redundancies, every single one is different, every plan is different, every detail of the project plan needs to be done. And I also think we should be upskilling managers who are involved in it, because they get damaged as well. And I'm sure Rob is going to talk about mental health being very high on the HR agenda now. And there are methodologies such as non-violent communication, which is an extremely good technique to get into when you've got a potential dispute on your hand. I think we're missing a trick using psychometric profiling so that we can see what kinds of working certain people like. You know, I love working from home. I've got friends who absolutely loathe it. That's completely predictable from their psychometric. They need different things from the workplace. So I think we're missing a trick when we're planning redundancies, planning restructures, by not actually asking people what methods are going to work for them. And that might help you reshape the design of the organization before you start. And I think another thing that comms people could work hand in hand with HR people to do is there is often not a competency framework. And by that I mean a set of clear behavioral statements of what are the non-technical things that you want to see in somebody in a particular job. And if you don't have that language, then it's very hard to measure gaps and articulate what you mean. For example, a manager may say, well, I want him to go because he's so arsey. I say, well, what do you mean arsey? Well, bad attitude. What do you mean bad attitude? What behaviors does that person demonstrate that you want doing differently? Because you can then got a chance of somebody shifting their behavior. And if you combine that plus say a technique like non-violent communication, psychometrics, you're going to end up with a better design to start with. So the person delivering the messages is going to have a much easier time because they know what they're doing and why they're doing it, and they've got proper data.
So if you had a group of communicators, as you do, and they're thinking, crumbs, this is probably going to come my way in the next 2 to 3 months, I'm going to have to do, what resources and what preparation should they be thinking about in anticipation that they're going to have to do this thing? How do they find out about nonviolent communication? What other resources would you recommend they look at?
Well, the glib answer, of course, Liam, is give me a ring. I'd be delighted to hear from you. I think
I set them up for you.
You did. Make sure you've got the right advisor and the right person for you. Acknowledge the bits you know and the bits you don't know. Keep the HR department, if there is one, under control. And if there isn't, make sure you've got somebody who knows what they're doing. It isn't easy. And there are so many misunderstandings about redundancy, restructure, employment law. Every April we have a huge new raft of employment law. This year, one example is new employment contracts have to be issued from day one of employment. That came in April this year. A lot of clients, even FTSE clients, don't even realise that, haven't implemented it. So there's already a potential breach of contract. So get together and I can't think of a better combination than HR and comms together. That's why we're here.
Fantastic. Yes, I always found that there were days when I could cheerfully have murdered my colleagues in HR, but actually it was always HR that saves your bacon at the end of the day. Actually, it's,
well, HR people they don't always help themselves, and they used to be called the uniform brigade when I was in a big multinational, and I don't think they do themselves any favours. You need to know the rules so that you know how to break them. And with your help of your comms friends, you can do that very nicely and creatively. I have a client on the call here. I don't know whether he wants to comment on anything I've said. He might tell you it's different in practice.
Oh, he's on the spot now. So,
yeah, I just saw a message from Annabel, and does anybody care to share a war story? And I literally, as you were saying that, Claire, I typed in yes. Well, I didn't want to steal your thunder. We've been through a number of, I should say first I'm the chief exec of a small professional body, and we don't have our own internal HR function, but it's delegated to somebody within the team. We we've had quite a few HR issues in the last couple of years, and you know, we even had an issue with the person that I'm speaking about now. And we used a different set of advisors, I'll be very honest, and we found that because we hadn't worked out what the outcomes may be, because we didn't script it properly, because we kind of rushed headlong into some of these things, we ended up in some awful messes. And we ended up in a situation where in some cases we were having to make payouts because we hadn't done things properly, and things that we could have really avoided. In the very latest one, which started back in February, we found we were going round in circles with our advisors, and I won't sort of bore the audience with the details of that, but when we brought Claire and her team in, they took a very pragmatic approach. They wanted a whole raft of information from us, all the things that Claire has said, in order to plan thoroughly. It was painful for a few days. We had to go away and find things that we didn't even know where they were, particularly with a lockdown situation. But then we found over the last few weeks that it actually, the hard stuff was actually easier than it had been over the previous few months. And we got the result that the organisation needed to have in a far, far, far quicker time, even though it was a bit stressful and painful. And if we hadn't been forced to go through those processes that Claire said, I suspect we'd still be in the same situation now. And the use of some of the tools that she's mentioned as well, you know, we've got other issues in our team. You know, we've since sat down with members of Claire's team to plan the strategy going forward. What are these tools that we need that we didn't realise that we needed in the past? So I feel now we're in a far stronger position to tackle some of these issues, and hopefully we won't go through the mire in the future like we have done in the past. So thank you very much, Claire.
Well, thank you, Gareth, for that. And I've also posted in the chat box a question to the rest of the group to see what resources they found useful over the years, because that's an opportunity for us to share things. So thank you very much, Claire. Hopefully we'll be able to bounce off you as we go forward now. Back to you, Annabel.
Lovely, thanks Liam, and thanks Claire, and what a rich seam of material you covered there: psychometric testing, competency frameworks, non-violent communication, all of which could span a whole hour's conversation in themselves. So thank you for that, and for those of you that aren't familiar with all of those, then do give Claire a buzz. So Victoria, over to you, top right hand corner in my bingo card here. You've worked with a range of leaders, very senior leaders in travel and pharma and too many sectors to mention. So in a nutshell, could you tell us what makes for a great leader in uncertain times?
So I think particularly at the moment, but it's always the case, as alluded to earlier, I think empathy and emotional intelligence, it's just such an incredibly important skill for a leader these days. When you see people that have communicated well and communicated difficult decisions well over recent times, I'm thinking about Bernard Looney at BP, for example. There was an Airbnb announcement that came out quite early on in lockdown as they were suffering the impacts of COVID and lockdowns. When you look at those messages, really, really tricky messages to communicate, and we've certainly had our fair share within my own organisation, and it's about really emphasising that you understand the impact. And I think, as mentioned earlier, every job loss is a tragedy for that individual, and not being afraid to let that shine through in your communications, whether you do it at a bigger scale or in a one-to-one situations. I think that's incredibly important. And I think we all know in the current environment, it isn't just like when we were making organizational changes in the past, but it's the uncertainty of the recession that we have without a doubt coming as well. So that's really, really important. I think sharing a vision for the future always remains incredibly important when communicating difficult messages and explaining why. So at the moment, there's obviously a lot of organizations that have difficult messages that are COVID related, but sometimes they aren't. Sometimes it's just part of an ongoing transformation, and it's part of a strategic direction that you're taking as a business, because it's about safeguarding the business for the long term and the organization for the long term. And I think really explaining that and making sure that people understand that it isn't something personal. I think taking that, oh, it's about me, I've done something wrong here, and really reassuring people that that's not the case is really, really important as well. I also think that, and we all know, all of us who have worked in corporate environments know that you can't always share everything all of the time as much as you would love to, and you're often balancing that difficult situation of how much can we say, when can we say it, what's going to be the impact of telling people in a certain way, etc., etc. Not to mention from a HR perspective and a legal perspective, and that's always a balancing act. And I think we in employee communications have an important role there to really pressure test and push for people for leaders to be as transparent as they can be and as honest as they can be.
I was going to come on to the role of employee communications in this. We've talked about leaders in uncertain times.
Yeah.
So do you think the communicator's role has changed, particularly very topically during COVID? Do you think they've come to the fore? And can you give me some examples of what changes have come about?
Absolutely. I mean, from my perspective, I've been in lots of networking groups like this, and I've talked to colleagues in other organizations, and I think it seems to be something that everyone agrees that there is internal communications and engagement teams have really had an opportunity to step up, show how they can add value, and be really responsive. For us in my team, I had a really newly established team, so it meant that we really quickly had to reprioritize how we worked, a small team, and what would add the most value for the organization given what it was going through. What we've been able to do, and I think in many other companies as well, is really show how we don't just communicate things, we don't take a message and then deliver it, but we've actually actively helped shape the messages, and thinking about being part of work streams and working group that look at the guidance that's coming out from government. Sometimes it's been very clear, sometimes maybe not so clear, and we've had to make a huge amount of judgment calls in terms of how we communicate, when we communicate, and how far we go with guidance and so on. So that's where we really feel that we've built a lot of trust and credibility with our C-suite particularly.
Can I just check whilst you're talking, I'm listening intently, but there's also some background feedback. Has anybody got something just happening in the background there? No, that seems to have gone now I've said it, so that's perfect, thank you. Okay, so can you tell me, so you've seen some changes during COVID. What about how that will affect going forwards? Do you think agility or the role of communicators in shaping strategy will change as a result?
I think so. I think in many ways, certainly what we've been trying to do in terms of modernizing the way we communicate, making sure that leaders are a lot more authentic, visible, that we're using digital tools to help people connect. All of those things, it's almost like it's just been accelerated in a way that I never thought would be possible in such a short amount of time. I mean, if we look, for example, at Yammer use at Capita, that's gone up about 70% in terms of active users just since March. So that just gives you one example. And that was probably our target for the whole year. So it's really, really interesting. I think in terms of just being responsive and trying new things when you have such a short lead time to plan is something that I think will continue, and just being really agile, but also having courage to testing new things and then learning and then looking at insights and data and playing that back to leaders and other stakeholders and saying, okay, this worked well, this didn't. So, okay, well, if we're going to kill something, we'll kill it fast because the data shows us that it didn't work. But if it's something that did work, we'll use that and we'll scale up and try that again in the future. So that I think will continue.
Mm. And deviating slightly from tough conversations, I'm interested in, because you've got such a wide experience and had a long track record in internal comms and employee engagement. What do you think, if you were in a time travel machine 5 years hence, what do you think the landscape might look? Will there be any significant differences on the basis we're working from home or remote working? The new millennials coming through and what they expect from a comms role. Can you paint a picture of what comms in 5 years might look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think for organizations, I think being purpose-led and staying true to your values and really thinking about your reputation will continue to be something that is incredibly important. And you mentioned millennials and so on. I think that's something that will remain really, really important, not just for that group, but for other groups as well. And I think a lot of insight and data already point to that. That's something that is important for your employer brand and who people want to work for. So I think a lot of companies will be evaluated on how they actually went through the COVID period based on those values and those and the organization's purpose. I think that people want to continue to be involved and actually actively help shape things. So we've got a program called Shaping Tomorrow Together at the moment, which is the next phase of our almost pandemic planning work stream, if you like. And as part of that, for example, we had about 10% of our company opted in from following on from a survey to continue to be involved in shaping how we learn from what we've been through over recent months. So I think that just goes to show the appetite there is for people to continue to be involved. I also think that the blurring of channels, internal versus external, will continue, and that will be super interesting to see where that goes, because if you look at some organizations, again, I'm going to use BP as an example, the way that their leaders are using LinkedIn, we're trying to do similar things using Instagram and so on to connect with colleague groups, but also drive their purpose and their values. I think that will continue.
Fantastic. We've got a bit of sound issue coming from you, Victoria. So at this point,
that.
That's all right, just the very last sentence. But whilst you're still there, I'm going to ask Joss to come in. He made a very good point in the chat. Joss, would you unmute yourself and just feedback on your, I want to pronounce it VUCA, but it sounds a bit like Veruca. But Joss, over to you.
Yeah, I completely agree with Victoria's point. I think empathy is absolutely at the core of navigating this successfully. I think it's at the core of understanding your customers. It's at the core of understanding what's going on with your employees. You know, so I think the best leaders are listening first before they try and communicate. And so many clients, but other, you know, gatherings like this where I've heard from communicators and others, it's the leaders who've said, look, I don't know. And they've put themselves out there and been vulnerable and said, you know what, I'm feeling, you know, this is distracting too. I'm not really sure. And, you know, actually almost, you know, not going into the old trap of saying, yes, well, I'm the figurehead leader who knows everything and I know best, but actually listening, what do you think? You know, what ideas have you got? The organizations that will be successful coming out of this will be the ones that can move incredibly fast, very agile, and, you know, bring their people with them. You're only going to do that by effectively crowdsourcing the best ideas from your people and crowdsourcing the best ideas from your customers. So organizations that aren't do that are going to find themselves severely, severely challenged, because the pace of change we've got today is going to be the slowest we'll ever know it.
And Joss, can you just tell us where you're from, just the context of your experience? Just so
yeah, sure. So I work with Victoria at GSK. So I was head of employee engagement globally at GSK for a number of years. I left a couple of years ago, and I now work as an independent consultant and coach. So I work with a range of organisations now around the issues we're talking about, but particularly around change. And I've been facilitating a wide range of executive roundtables for a number of clients. And it's been, you know, fascinating hearing the themes that are coming out, very consistent with what Victoria is saying. But I think the ones who will be successful are the ones whose leaders are the more progressive ones, the ones who are more modern.
Fantastic. Over to
leading behaviours, valiant, understanding, authentic.
Yeah. And the other thing I was going to add to what Joss said was that I think your point is well made about the leaders, the old-fashioned leader who thought that the way to lead was to look like they knew everything and had everything under control and they thought everything through. I think the most successful leaders as a communicator I've ever worked with are ones who know that people are making a judgment about them as a person. They don't necessarily want the leader to know all the answers, but they want to know that their heart's in the right place and they want to know that they're the sort of person they can trust and they like. And I've told this story a million times, but I had one leader who was going to get a £22 million bonus at a time when we'd made millions of people redundant and no one had a pay rise for 3 years. When he, you know, and he went out and he spoke to people, and I thought he was going to get lynched or, you know, certainly shot. But people came out of those sessions going, yeah, fair play to him. You know, I don't think it's necessarily fair that he's getting a big bonus, but he seems like the sort of bloke who'll get us out of this. And And I think people like, everyone who's got a journalistic background will know that the old adage, people like people. So, just talking to leaders and just saying it's okay to go and just talk to people, go and talk about what you're thinking and what you read, and share the thoughts that are going into your process. That's okay, because that's what people are going to judge you on, not whether or not you've got a fantastic PowerPoint with 62 bullet points on it.
I think that's a key point. And actually, I think for a long time in organisations, we've had an empathy gap. I think there's been too much space between leaders and employees, so they haven't felt like, it's a them and us situation. It doesn't feel equitable. So leaders who actually squash that gap by actually talking to people, listening to them, understanding their ideas, their concerns, what would actually make it better, and then acting upon it. So what's the point of doing an employee survey if you don't take any action on it? You've got to listen to your people and then respond to their concerns. And I think when you do that, it shrinks that gap massively. As well, I think when the pandemic first kicked off, you saw a lot of a sense of community. And then towards the end, you have this sort of creeping back of them and us, the Dominic Cummings news, seen it with Trump in the States, the whole, tensions around racial inequality. So, I think there's empathy is at the root of this for me. I think it's a really important point.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John.
This must be music to Rob's ears.
Absolutely. And I was just listening to a lot of the adjectives there: authenticity, honesty, openness, vulnerability. These are the buzzwords that we want to hear for leadership that can facilitate the well-being and mental health of the organisation and the people within it. And interestingly, Bernard Looney is a great example, because he's been very open about the fact that he has had a mental health challenge, and is one of the few leading CEOs of large organisations that is showing that level of vulnerability. But for me, the quote that resonates through all this is, and you hear it all the time at the moment, is the Maya Angelou one of "People will remember how you make them feel." And I think how we're communicating with our people through this pandemic will have a big impact on how they're feeling, and will have a big impact on engagement and loyalty as we come through it.
Yeah. So, I guess one of the challenges. What advice would you give to a communicator who has to work with a leader who doesn't have a great deal of natural empathy? What kind of advice would you be giving them?
Well, I think when we look at communicating some of the tough things that we're going to have to communicate, we probably have to take a harsh look on who is doing that communication. And some of the great examples, the Airbnb is one. The CEO of the Marriott Group did some awesome communication at the start of lockdown, again expressing the tough times for everyone. But if you're not that sort of empathetic CEO, perhaps you're not the right person to be communicating on all of these issues. And I think the role of the internal comms professional probably takes on greater emphasis, because you're probably shouldering more of the load, I would have thought. But for me, I think it's around, and my view is probably slightly narrower than most, because I'm focusing on the mental health and well-being of people. We can't ignore that as part of how we're communicating, and that can be the survivor's guilt of people that weren't furloughed, the survivor's guilt of people that aren't let go in terms of redundancy, how we're communicating redundancies, the psychological safety of people coming back into the big wide world and the workplace. We can't ignore it. So this part of the how are we communicating, and it's been articulated really well, and I can probably add a little bit to it. But I think it's also the what, and it's a recognition of the fact that people are struggling right now. People are struggling with a rise in the level of anxiety, a level of uncertainty about the economic situation, a fear of returning into the physical workspace, because that's the big bad world. And so we can't ignore this. We have to tackle it. And I think the best organizations have been prioritizing the well-being of employees throughout the pandemic. The worst organizations have been ignoring it. And I think it was John Flint, the ex-CEO of HSBC, spoke at one of my events and said, if you're really not tackling the mental health and well-being issue by now, are you truly fit to be a leader? Because it is that serious. And I think it's one of the great challenges and great opportunities of our time. So part of it is, for me, is the how, but it's also the what. And I think we can't be ignoring the well-being of our people right now.
I thought I'm really taken by, you know, you've got your screen behind you, it's got your form score on it, and I'm really quite taken by your approach, which is about saying, well, let's get people to talk on a daily basis about how they feel about it. I was wondering, could you just tell people what the form score is all about?
Yeah, sure. So the short version of my story, I experienced bipolar disorder. For many years, I kept that to myself. And then in 2017, I was motivated by the fact I saw more and more people being open about mental health challenges. And that has taken me on a journey as a campaigner. But the form score, it's a tool that a therapist gave to me many years ago by saying, what is my score today out of 10? And there's a number of questions that go into that, from how well have I slept, how well have I exercised, how well am I balancing stress, to sense of purpose, to financial well-being. There's about 10 questions I ask. And then I give myself a number out of 10. And then very briefly, as a campaigner, what I've been doing is publishing that and just watching the reaction, publishing in my email signature and LinkedIn account. And because of the stigma of mental ill health, people are very reluctant to answer that question, how are you today, honestly and authentically. We say, I'm good, I'm fine, I'm okay, and we kind of walk away. Whereas if we talk about form rather than mental health, if we talk about a number out of 10, rather than asking people to describe how they're feeling, what this does is provide a language that is less threatening for people to communicate, how are they today? So I've seen this used in team meetings, in family groups, quite broadly within businesses, as a way of checking in with people, particularly when we're kind of over Zoom and over video conference, as a way of being able to communicate that in a slightly less threatening way.
So, sorry, I do beg your pardon. My dog's decided to turn up outside the door.
He was communicating his form score in.
Oh, my sense is his form score is always 9 or 10. So,
it's a dog's life, right?
So I'm quite curious, because my experience of working in a comms team at times of when it's really tough is that you kind of get sucked into the work. You're working, you turn up at 8, you're not leaving the office till 9 or 10 at night, and it's just like relentless, and you find yourself sitting in meetings where people are kind of like discussing really quite tough issues, but in an almost blasé sort of way. And on one occasion, I remember having to physically eject someone from my office because he was screaming abuse at a member of our team, because he was so angry and upset about, all the stuff that was going on in the organisation. And I think quite often, a lot of people in HR or in comms don't actually, have a self-care strategy for themselves during tough times. They think that their job is just to soldier on and just to get through stuff. And what kind of advice would you have to people who find themselves in that kind of workplace situation where actually they're the only person, no one seems to care about them. Their job is just to get through it.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think for me, it starts by giving yourself the gift of a moment of self-reflection each day to answer that question honestly. How am I today? What is driving my form? Have I slept enough? Am I taking those little breaks in the day that don't need to be that time consuming, but can have a big impact on our productivity? Just getting away from your desk for 5 minutes every hour to stretch and remove yourself from this narrow window of vision, which is our screen. So I think it starts by allowing yourself to care for yourself, and it's the gift of self-kindness. I think then it's building up a little bit of literacy around what is it that drives your form or your mental well-being. So for me, I know it's sleep, it's exercise, and it's social connections. But others might be needing to find a sense of purpose or have money worries that they need to address, or whatever it might be, balanced nutrition. And then take small steps forward. So if you prioritize an extra 30 minutes of sleep tonight, you will receive the benefit of it the next day. But I think importantly, when we're looking to influence people around us in the workplace, be it our leadership team, be it our employees, I think we have a kind of obligation to role model healthy behaviors, particularly those of us in leadership positions, because how can we expect our people to be doing those simple things that I mentioned if we're sending emails at 11 o'clock at night and not looking after ourselves? I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest performance gains we can make is by just giving ourselves a little boost in our well-being by practicing self-care. You know, the costs of presenteeism, underperforming in the workplace because of suboptimal mental health. It was 29 billion to UK employees pre-lockdown. It'll be higher than that now. That's Deloitte numbers. So I think it's knowing that actually this investment in time and investment in thought can have, it's both the right thing to do as an organisation and individual level, but it can also have a big payoff in our productivity.
No. So in a second, we're just going to come to everyone in the chat and ask them for their advice and their self-care tips. We're going to ask them to share those in a second in the chat box, or start sharing them. But I just wanted to ask one last question is, do you have any advice for a communicator who's producing communications on behalf of the whole organisation? How is there anything that they should possibly be doing to make sure that their communications are mindful of the stress that their colleagues across the organisation as a whole have?
I think it comes back to empathy on this one. I think it comes back to the fact that, you know, everybody is going to have there's something called hypervigilance going on right now. So we're all hypervigilant for danger. So flight or fight response is triggered much more easily at the moment. So I think in those messages that we're getting around the future of, you know, jobs, workplace, business as usual, people are going to be looking for danger in that. So I think if we know that when we're drafting those communications and where we're thinking, it's just trying to put ourselves in the shoes of people who are scared about their future, scared about returning to work, scared about their jobs, scared about providing for their family. And these sound like worst case scenarios, but they're not, they're really common. And thinking, actually, how can we communicate with vulnerability, openness, honesty, and not having all of the answers to mitigate creating additional fear? And there's no easy answer to that. Again, I'd point you to the CEO of the Marriott Group, who didn't have all the answers. He's running a hotel group, but communicated in a very open, empathetic way. So I don't feel that that's a good enough answer, but it's kind of the best I've got.
No, well, that seems quite good.
Yeah, can I bring in Tom Cotton at this point? Tom, the founder of Mind Environment, which has lots of synergies with what Rob is talking about. And Tom, I understand you'd like to just talk about how you foster well-being before it registers as a crisis or ill health. So do unmute yourself. Thanks.
Annabel. Hi, everyone.
Hear you, fantastic.
Rob, really interesting. Thank you very much for that. I've had a series of conversations today about, I suppose, sort of loosely around this topic. I think what we're acknowledging is the importance of internal communication. I mean, within an organization, between team members, between organizations, but also the internal communication that we have individually. What's going on in ourselves? How can we notice what's going on? How can we register it before it becomes a crisis? And the conversations that I'm thinking of today are around about the eternal conundrum, which is that organizations and leaders really value the ability to develop, you know, some of the skills that we're talking about, so empathy, emotional intelligence, etc. But the conundrum is, how do you encourage people to take up that kind of work before it actually becomes a crisis? So often, so I mean, I'm a psychologist, I work clinically, I work as a coach as well. Often what brings people into that kind of conversation is when the situation has spiraled into a crisis. So I'm really interested in this conundrum. You know, there's general recognition that there's huge value in this work, but then how do you engage with the lack of uptake? Over
to you, Rob. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Tom, and I think, you know, part of this is culture change, but part of it is really understanding the benefits of investing in prevention or promotion, i.e., why should we be doing all of this before we fall into crisis? Now, if you look at some of the analytics that have been done, you know, your interventions in mental health and well-being, when someone is struggling, you'll get a 1-to-1 return at best. You intervene in a preventative way, you're getting between 5 and 9-to-1 returns, and we need more kind of ROI data on that. But I think it's really highlighting the benefits of investing in this sort of stuff early, as opposed to when people end up in crisis. But I think it's about trying to create a culture where people understand the value of it, because the problem where mental health is concerned is it's got a brand problem. For one, we say the words mental health, we think of this, a mental illness. And so the second point is people think mental health only applies to me if I've got mental illness. And so is a literacy program about getting people to understand the benefits of sleeping a bit more, or exercising, or eating well on their mental health as well as their physical health. And you know, for a leadership team, it's the right thing to do, but the return on investment numbers, you know, any CFO would take, but they don't know that yet. So it's again pulling on the moral case and the business case, I think.
There's a really interesting phenomenon, which is when something is not working and it registers an individual who for whatever reason is breaking down, or communication is breaking down, then it sort of registers as a mental health problem. But I forget who came up with the who was citing the example earlier of working with a difficult manager. Perhaps it was you, Claire, I forget now. But where the team recognizes that there's somebody within the organization who's burning out other people, who's very difficult to deal with. Who was talking about that?
I probably talked about it by implication because I see it all the time, but I can remember being on a seminar with other HR people and saying, you know, I've done 8 years of psychoanalysis, and they looked at me as though I was stark staring bonkers. I think it's a fantastic thing to embark on, but it's a long process, and it certainly made me a better coach. But I think some of this is about recruitment mistakes. You know, you've got the wrong person running an organization, you've got the wrong leaders leading the HR function, and there are some fundamentals that need to come into currency, not just the whole issue of mental health, but business things like talking about output, not input, because as Liam was indicating, there's a danger at the moment that there are no boundaries, and boundaries are everything. So if we could postulate more about how to reinforce your boundaries, then by so doing, you take more care of mental health, you take more care of yourself, and you start talking about output and breaks in the workplace, which I think is very important, and we don't spend enough time on. We're too busy beating people to produce what we want them to produce.
Liam, you're on mute. We need to unmute you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Claire. I want to bring Rose in because you made a very interesting observation a second or so ago in the chat box. Would you just share that with the group and what was on your mind? Because before we finish up by just asking our guests for their closing comments. But I'd love to, if you could share your comments from the chat box for us.
Yes, right. Of course. And thank you to everybody who's spoken today. It's been really insightful and interesting to listen to everyone's point of view. I think the point I was making is that it's very easy as businesses, and I've worked in a variety of agencies, and you get used to your clients asking customers getting the customer perspective in order to improve, but sometimes we don't always take that same discipline internally and look at our internal customers and ask, you know, individually how what's on their mind and how that could make us better leaders. I think one of the things I've really learned since this crisis, where of course everything is heightened because you're only speaking on Zoom, and then you're sick to death of Zoom, and you're not getting that same interaction. And it was actually, I was having a conversation with a team member who just said, nobody ever asks, how is your mental health? Just asks the question. And so in the course of that conversation, I felt, well, how is your mental health? And I got so much more than I would have otherwise out of that conversation about what was going on with them and how how I could support that. And sometimes it feels like a bit of it doesn't feel a natural question to ask. And I think, to your point, Rob, that's because we've all got a bit of we've all danger of having a bit of unconscious bias about having a conversation about mental health and thinking that, yeah, you've got to have something, you've got to actually have a mental illness. But actually just asking the question you can get an awful lot back simply by listening then to the answer. So that whole idea of customer insight, flip it on its head and think about it internally, and we could become much better leaders as a result.
Fantastic.
100% agree. 100%.
I'm just very conscious of the time, and I actually sense that this is a topic that we could probably stretch for another hour or so, because I think it's really pertinent to us in our profession in a number of ways, but I'm conscious of the time. So I just wanted to just wrap up, as it were, and I'm just going to ask Claire, do you have any closing thoughts based on what we've been talking about and what you've heard?
I think recruit the right people into the HR function. And I think we are still recruiting heads of HR for an era that is long gone. And it needs to be somebody who is not just intellectually smart, but emotionally very intelligent. And I have noticed in some big organizations where we've put in appraisal schemes, we've put in a mood score, and we've weighted soft competency performance, so non-technical delivery, as more important. So things like leadership and communications, actually rewarding those soft competencies more heavily than because somebody happens to be a good accountant or a good lawyer. That we look at behaviours and we rate them more highly. And sad though it is, remuneration drives behaviour. So if you reward bad behaviour in emotional terms, you get bad behaviour. And that's why I think pulling together the mental health stage, the HR stage and the comms stage is so valuable.
Thanks very much.
Victoria, would you like to unmute yourself? Any closing comments from you before we wrap up today's call?
Well, just a quick one. I think it's just, for me, everything that I have heard just shows how much we have a role in employee communications and engagement to really hold up the mirror to leaders as they prepare to deliver difficult messages, and just as we coach them on an ongoing basis, and really have the courage to speak the truth, and also use insights and data and feedback to really influence and shape that. So I think that's what we have to do, and sometimes it's quite difficult, but I think it pays off in the long run. And yeah, I think everything I've heard today proves that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Victoria. And over to Rob, but just to say there's some fantastic sound bites coming out of this call, so please feel free to tweet and hashtag chat and connect. We really want to build a head of steam around this idea of mental health HR comms coming together. So do listen back to it, or any notes you've made, do feel free to tweet. Rob, final quick comment from you.
Thank you. So I think you guys and girls have a unique opportunity in comms and HR as well, but in comms particularly in influencing this agenda. But for me, I think I'd summarize by saying, give yourselves the gift of those moments of reflection on your own form, and just try and take one step forward, do something differently that can move you to slightly better form, because you'll get the rewards in spades. And I think, try the form score. Ask your team or your connections, how are you today? Share your score first. It's a great way of starting a meeting, because you've both exhibited a bit of vulnerability and you brought it onto the agenda. So I hope you find it useful. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Rob. So it just remains for me to say thank you to all our guests, Claire, Victoria and Rob. And I'm sure they're open to receiving a LinkedIn request should you wish to. Thanks to all our participants for all the chat you've been giving down the side. Fantastic. And again, do link in with those that you've met on the call today. We will be sending out a brief 2-question pulse check. It's all about feedback to help us understand what you enjoyed, what you want more of or less of. We really want to build this into an ongoing community for communicators to chat and connect. So thank you. And finally to Liam.
Yeah, and thank you very much. I mean, that's been super useful and very interesting. For those of you who don't know, the PRCA has just launched a mental health and communications toolkit, which you can access via the PRCA website. And I think that's just actually hot off the presses in the last few days. So it's well worth having a look at that and getting some inspiration from that. Our intention is the next time we meet for a chat and connect, we'll be talking about leadership and comms in more detail, hopefully with some input from leaders. Although after the last 20 minutes of conversation, I think Annabel and I might want to go back to the drawing board and see if there's scope for a longer conversation on what's actually a super important subject. And maybe there's a need for communicators in tough times to have a place where we can talk about these issues as well. So just to say thank you very much for your time, thank you very much for your comments. Look out for the 2-question pulse check that Annabel will be sending out in the next day or so, and we'll also be sending you a link to the recording of this in the next couple of days. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks for joining us.